This is the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community.
You might just learn something.
I think you'll enjoy it.
The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production. And now, here's your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plaw.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the PowerShell Podcast. I'm host Jordan with mega star host Andrew Plaw.
Yes, super mega.
And today we have a fantastic guest, Avri, or you may know him on Twitter as PowerShell on Linux. We're excited to have you because we've never broached the subject because neither Andrew nor I know what to do with it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thanks for including me and the don't know how to use it. I've had a little bit of exposure to PowerShell on Linux, like mostly in the context of some CTFs and I think some Raspberry Pi stuff. Always fun.
But it says on your account that you started the PowerShell on Linux because you felt like it was not getting the same love for content or support that just PowerShell in general was.
Yeah, so I guess the main, so I've been a Linux and I guess open source and FOSS like enthusiast for, I don't know, since like 2005 or something like that. And I mean, I've been using PowerShell for, I don't know, a good while, and then when Microsoft added support for the PowerShell core, now known as the like PowerShell 7, I installed it on my system, and then I realized how amazing it is and how much I like it. But the problem in all these communities is that every time I would go and let's say like a community in Telegram or Twitter or all kinds of the Linux communities, I would always get like, oh, you're a Microsoft shill, you're getting paid by Microsoft. Microsoft never contacted me, and I got a lot of pushback. But I wanted to create like this safe community for people that like PowerShell and also like Linux, so they can come and share things and collaborate. Because I think PowerShell, like the PowerShell community is very. I mean, a lot of modules are open source. I mean, there's a lot. I really like the spirit that the PowerShell community has, and I wanted to bring both of them together. And so I created a Twitter account and I created a Telegram group that later evolved to a Discord, and then eventually we set the Discord off and we connected it with the Discord. We bridged it with the Discord of the PowerShell community to the Linux room, the Linux channel in the Discord, and then like we added Matrix into the mix, and it's like it became this whole thing of a community where you can come. If you sometimes people come and they talk about like Bash and they try to convert, or sometimes people come from the Linux side and they're like, oh, I have this PowerShell script, I'm trying to figure out what it does and stuff like that. This pretty much why I started. Like I wanted to show Linux people how awesome PowerShell is, and I wanted a safe place to do it.
So you said that a lot of the community instantly, because Microsoft 4 historically was so locked down, has there been any inroads made with Microsoft has done more and more open source stuff, or is it still that bridge is burned and there's in some people's mind no going back?
So it really depends. For some people are like you're never going to change their mind. There's the whole saying like embrace like extinguish. I forgot how it goes, but it's like that Microsoft, that I think Steve Ballmer said somewhere in the 90s or the early 2000s, and the Linux people remember all that. And some people are actually they see what PowerShell can do, or they see, I mean, VS Code. Like Microsoft has contributed a lot to Linux in recent years, and some people are they like it. They wanna, they use VS Code as their editor. They want more and more things, and I mean, so you're always going to have extremists, but I think overall, like, a lot of people in the Linux community are open to listen. They might not use it on their system, or they might not use a default shell on their system and stuff like that, but they're not hostile towards it.
Which that's a big improvement. Not hostile means there's a lot more collaboration that's likely to happen.
Mhm.
Everyone wins in that case.
I mean, good on
Yeah.
Microsoft for going open source to kind of take that first effort and, contribute in other ways. It's been
And some people think, like, oh, what happens if Microsoft decides to close the source? But I mean, I don't. I think at this point, with so many people, so many companies use PowerShell, I think if it happens with other projects that try to go closed source, and then like the project was forked, and the community continued to manage it with, and I think the same thing will happen if Microsoft decides to do closed source PowerShell. I think a lot of people in the community will take over. So I don't think they have any reason, especially with more stuff going open source, .NET and everything. I don't see a reason for them to do it. But that's the beautiful thing with open source. Like, once the code is out there, you can. I mean, companies try to go closed source, and usually it failed. So I don't see them doing it.
It would definitely be a weird choice at this point, because it was popular when they did it, and to undo it now, you'd be burning all goodwill they spent 18,
Building,
20
yeah.
years trying to build. Yeah, it'd be a weird choice.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's part of their strategy, to be honest, especially the whole owning GitHub thing.
So, but before we went live, we were talking a bit about Linux, and you said that one of the problems you run into is everything you see recommended to get PowerShell on Linux is to use the snap. And you said you're
not everything, but a lot of the stuff is because snaps are snap is a technology invented by Canonical, the creators of Ubuntu, and it's very nice because it's supposed to create like a universal way to install packages across multiple distros, and it definitely works. But in my experience, the snap, the snap technology, and the snap, even though the PowerShell snap uses classic confinement, which is supposed to be no confinement, I've encountered a few like edge cases that create problems with the way PowerShell works, and I personally prefer and have a lot more success installing PowerShell as either using the native like distro. So if you're running Ubuntu, you can install the deb package, or if you're running Debian, and if you're a Fedora, you can install the RPM, or you can like install the packages that made for CentOS or Red Hat. Usually they work. And I have a lot of more success. It starts faster. It's actually amazing to see that. I think PowerShell works a lot better on Linux than it does on Windows. I think it's a lot faster. I think it's a lot of stuff. It starts faster. Everything is. I personally prefer it on a Linux system than on a Windows system.
Whoa.
That's a
controversial, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question about using PowerShell on Linux. So say I'm a Linux person, been using it for a long time, but okay, PowerShell seems kind of cool. I want to dabble. I'll use that as my shell of choice. Good choice, I may say. But are they still able to make use of their commands if they're using PowerShell? So like say you really want to use curl, you can still use it, but have access to some other features of PowerShell?
I think one of the first commits, or like one of the first issues that was opened when PowerShell went open source, is the conflicts with stuff like with the aliases for stuff like curl, and exactly for this reason. And yes, you can use all your Linux native commands in PowerShell. For example, I helped a podcaster friend of mine get the hold of a domain for his podcast using Whois in PowerShell to monitor, when the domain renewal was going to expire, and it send me an alert using Telegram or so. It was a collaboration of PowerShell and Whois for like the Linux native command, and it all works fine. Obviously, if you use Linux commands, you don't get objects back, so you lose a little bit of the magic that PowerShell has. But you could definitely do it. You can farce the output and stuff like that. And it actually one topic that I think kind of like one topic that I wanted to talk about is that PowerShell is great, but I do believe that you need to use the tool for the job, right? So if you want to run containers, you're not going to use PowerShell. You use Docker, you use Containerd, you use different technologies. And a lot of times, like people, that, oh, we know PowerShell, so they try to use PowerShell to resolve every issue they have. And I don't think it's like, when the saying is like, when all you have is a hammer, everything look like a nail. So just because you can script, just because you can use PowerShell doesn't mean you should, right? Like sometimes you can use native commands to manage Kubernetes instead of talking to the API. You could use like kubectl or other tools to do the thing you want to do. And the nice thing is you can wrap those native tools with PowerShell.
So I actually run into that a bit with my current job. Is people ask, can you do that in PowerShell? To which I always answer yes. But no one ever asks, should I do that in PowerShell? Which is not always yes.
Yeah, so I could give you an example from many years ago when I used to work for a huge insurance company in the US. The guy that worked there before me, he was very heavy into scripting, and they used the VMware SRM, which is the site recovery manager. And a lot of the stuff that he did, he wrote a lot of scripts to work around the limitations of the product, with air quotes. So for example, one limitation was in SRM, you couldn't assign multiple IP addresses to the same network card for the virtual machine. So what did he do? He wrote a script that runs after when you execute the recovery, the site recovery automation for the DR site, and then he would assign all the IPs that the NIC was supposed to have. I solved the same problem by just adding additional NICs to the machine, and then the native system could assign different IPs to each NIC. So just because you can use PowerShell and you can use the automation to do something, sometimes there are better ways to do it. Like use the what's built into the tool, or what's built into the thing you're trying to do. Sometimes you have, obviously scripting and PowerShell can help you solve a lot of stuff, but it doesn't mean that sometimes you have to think about the issue and try to find the best tool for the job, even if PowerShell is not that tool.
That's a great point. And I think Jordan and I, we share those same feelings. Even though we host the PowerShell podcast, you might think that we recommend PowerShell for every single problem. And no, not always.
The can you is always yes. I might not know yet, but the answer is yes, I can do it in PowerShell.
But I tell you what, if you want to learn, do whatever sounds interesting. If your goal is learning, go try and solve those weird problems and get lost. You'll learn a thing or two. If it's interesting to you, take advantage of that.
Definitely. And I think I look at PowerShell as like the gateway drug, right? Like a lot of sometimes you're going to come across like technologies that are very complicated, and then PowerShell has like a commandlet to make them pretty simple, and then you can really learn how they work behind the scenes, as you learn to interact with them and work with them. I think for me, like PowerShell is what really introduced me to the whole REST API, how REST API works. Like with invoke REST command, it really opened my eyes to see. I mean, like the alternative that I had before that was kind of like curling things, and I personally, I mean, hate curl. Like, I mean, it's and some people love it, right? Like it's, I mean, and you could use it if you want, but like for example, I changed I use like in my Linux machine, I use a drop down terminal. I changed the default shell for that terminal to be PowerShell, and I use that as my daily shell, and I can always like pop into Bash if I have to, but I try to do everything in PowerShell.
I think that REST APIs are a great example of the power, right? Because REST APIs often return objects, and objects in PowerShell, that fits pretty well. Curl's a great tool. It's mature, but man, those objects.
I mean, as a Linux user of many years, like I just can't stand the fact that you have to like you get strings, and then you have to cut the strings, and you have to like mess with strings. It's like, it feels like such an archaic way to work. And not only that, by the way, one of the things Linux user hate the most about PowerShell, it's like its verbosity, where every parameter has, hyphen, I don't know, like some long, like, let's say, name, or and they prefer, -a, and then you have to look in through manuals to try to figure out, you have like awk -a minus this minus that, and nobody knows what it means. But I mean, unless you and a lot of times people come, to our community, and they're like, hey, I have this something like this, and they try to figure out what it does. So, but the funny thing is like Linux user look at it like it's a bad thing. Oh, the commands are long, like which is, I always find it funny, because you just press tab, right? Where we all like, you have autocomplete. Also, another thing I really like in PowerShell is that most Linux file system are case sensitive, right? But PowerShell isn't. So PowerShell, like for the most part, right? Unless you specifically want it to be. So I can do cd, which is and type the name, like the beginning of the name of the folder. It doesn't matter if it's uppercase, lowercase. PowerShell will figure it out, which is, I mean, in Linux, like in Bash, you have to worry about. I mean, it's also funny. Like we're in 2023 already. Like you have to worry about if you write a lowercase t or an uppercase t to go to your to a folder. It's like
that's always something that trips me up whenever I go to Linux. It's like, oh wait, no, I need to remember the exact casing of every single file I save. It kind of matters. Pick a standard and stick to it.
Yeah. Also, another thing, like I was helping, I was contributing to back to the topic of like REST APIs. I was contributing to a project, an open source project by Martin Wimpress. It's called QuickMU. It lets you like easily spin virtual machines in like a command using KVM and a few other things. And then over there, they get information. Like he was getting information of the different Linux distros, and some of it was JSON. And then you have to use like JQ and cut it, and like the syntax is so bad. And I felt, I mean, when I was contributing to it, I felt writing stuff in Bash. I felt like I was going back in time, trying to, like, with PowerShell, it's like so simple. Everything's an object. It's so easy, right? And I mean, I feel like Linux has so much to benefit from PowerShell, and Linux users can. I mean, it's great. I mean, we're talking about PowerShell and how amazing it is, but I mean, sometimes when you use native Linux tools, then you really feel like you're going back instead of moving forward.
So one of the big values of PowerShell being human readable is it lowers the curve of entry. Like
Mhm.
the barrier to entry is a lot. So, well, I understand if someone in Linux wants it a certain way, or they don't like the change. If the more people that adopt it, the better off it is. That's true for any operating system. So by lowering the barrier to entry, that's part of the reason why PowerShell took. I mean, the object, it's a fantastic tool, but human readable, I think, just made it accessible to so many people that would have never touched it.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I mean, I guess the term you want to like, I call it is like gatekeeping, right? It's like the gray beards want to keep their system the way it is, and like, and they they don't want change. But I think for a lot of people, it's very helpful where you don't like it's like a more coherent language, and obviously it's cross-platform. So if you're a Windows sysadmin or a DevOps engineer or something, you can bring your knowledge of PowerShell into another system. Obviously, there are limitations. There are things that are built into Windows that are a bit different, uh, like modules that don't work. And I mean, I personally like helped. I mean, the kind of like scratch my own itch. I helped port different modules that I want to use into Linux. One of them is like there's the PowerShell Selenium module, and I had I was using it at work for something, and then I was like, oh, I want to use it for some other project. I wanted to scrape some sites and stuff like that on my home machine. I was like, oh, this doesn't work on Linux, so I started like tinkering with it and adding support. I added the initial support for Linux on that module. Um, so I mean, it's very powerful that you can take like a Windows, right? Like a .NET DLL on a Linux machine, import it and use it. Like,
Yeah.
who would have thought like the DLLs on a Linux box, right?
We live in a magical time.
Super cool too. Like you mentioned earlier, you can be a Windows admin or whatever and be very comfortable at your fingertips at PowerShell, navigating, working with things, providers, things like that, modules, like you said. And then you can go to a different operating system and you have at least some familiarity. Like you can go to your home base, you can open up PowerShell and you can navigate that. There might be a bunch of different native commands available to you, but at least you have your go-tos.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely do, and a lot of stuff. Like the more things are progressing, like more things. I mean, you're not going to have like commands to manage a registry on a Linux box, right? But yeah, I mean, it's easier to deal with files. Like there's a lot of like commands that help you parse information, convert it. Like you don't have to deal with tools like I said, like JQ to convert to JSON or to convert from JSON or like all these like esoteric like you don't have to learn new tools just because you're on a Linux box. And also you get PowerShell rebooting over SSH. You get a lot of stuff like you and a lot for a lot of things you can write like one script and you can have it, you can use the native variables, right? Like is Linux, is Mac OS. You can write one script. Like for example, I have a script that set up my some people use Ansible. I use PowerShell to set up my system, so I have like a single script and it figures out, am I running on a Linux box? I installed the Linux packages based on like the distribution I'm on. I'm running on Windows. It installs like Scoop and like the tools and the other programs like the Winget and all the stuff I want. Like I can just have one script that figures out in a very simple way what system I'm on and configure it for me.
So it's an old Linux joke of, it's a little stick figure. Like if I tell Andrew, make me a sandwich, he's going to tell me no. But if I say sudo, make me a sandwich, he has to, right?
Yeah,
Does that
course,
work in PowerShell on Linux?
It does. So sudo is back to what we were saying. Sudo is a native command, and you have access to all the native commands of the system you're on. The downside is that when you run stuff as sudo, the default shell for the root user on, I think, 100% of Linux distros, unless some different distro changed it to like Fish or ZSH or whatever, then you're running as then your command. So if you do like sudo, I don't know, get child item or something, like it's gonna tell you like, what is get child item, because Bash doesn't know what get child item is. And I came across it and I was like, I still want to use my PowerShell commands in Linux in sudo. So I wrote PSSudo, which is PowerShell sudo, and what it does is a simple command. By the way, it's in the PowerShell gallery, version I think 0.0.1. But I use it on all my systems. Like I write PowerShell scripts and I do PSSudo and whatever script or PowerShell command that I want to run. And what it does, it serializes your command, and then it runs sudo pwsh, and then it forwards it as a serialized command, and then it deserializes it once it's running inside PowerShell, and then run your command, gives you the output back. It has limitation, right? Because of the whole serialized and deserialization. Then if you have commands that, like, let's say read host, you're trying to read the output, then in that context, you can't read information from the user. But for a lot of stuff, like I use it to update like the containers on my home lab and do a lot of stuff in PowerShell, which is my preferred language, or scripting language, I should say.
That's so cool. I love to hear that.
It sounds like I'll be getting a sandwich too.
And you could ask normal. You didn't even have to ask polite.
It has even like sudo, that joke has its own logo.
Oh, does it? Yeah.
Hilarious. Yeah.
I can imagine. You said that the default shell for most sudo users is Bash. I can imagine just one being PowerShell, just like with a pitchfork in the air. Like,
I'm sure you'll break the system in more ways than one if you do that. Like a lot of stuff, like will behave. For example, I was deploying like I was updating something. I think it was like Mastodon or something like that. And like the commands I was using, like PowerShell, like they were using like certain variables that are only available in Bash, and I had to like convert it a little bit for it to work, because obviously if you use a Bash native variable, it's not gonna work. But it's also a nice thing because I can always inside PowerShell write Bash and press enter, and then I'm in Bash and I can do whatever I want. But I also find it challenging and fun to try to make everything work in PowerShell, right? Like try to get everything I need and everything I do on a day-to-day basis work on PowerShell on Linux. Ready for another hot take?
Absolutely.
So you heard of Crescendo, right?
Oh,
I think personally Crescendo completely misses like the mark of like the PowerShell, the ability to run PowerShell on a Linux machine and use like the native tools. So the problem, as I see as a sysadmin, as a PowerShell user, is that if you wrap native commands with Crescendo, then you don't learn the actual commands that you're using, because you get this abstraction layer, and then when something doesn't work, you don't know how to fix it. So, for example, let's say you write you create a Crescendo module to wrap kubectl, which is like the command line to manage Kubernetes clusters, right? So then they keep adding stuff to this command, which means you have to upkeep the Crescendo module you keep creating and maintain it, which is, to the best of my knowledge, it doesn't look like Microsoft created many, like they don't publish these modules. So some people created stuff, right? But like there's no, it doesn't seem like they created this technology, but they don't, it doesn't look like they maintain many, and I could be wrong, but from what I've seen, but then you have to maintain this with the command, the native command that somebody is creating, right? And then if something doesn't work in this process to convert the output and stuff like that, you don't know how to fix it. But I don't see the reason having something like that, because, for example, I needed to get information from like a Kubernetes cluster, so I can create a variable like, I don't know, $J equals, and then type the command kubectl get pods or something, and do the output like -o, which gives me the output, and I can do JSON, and then I can pipe that to like convert from JSON. I can do all this stuff, but I learn how to use the tool, and I can use it in PowerShell, and I don't need to deal with all this like serials of an abstraction layer that is I personally, it's my personal opinion, is useless, because when something if something doesn't work, you don't know how to fix it. You don't know what the native command does. And another thing is, like, if you learn how to use the native command, when you go to a system that doesn't have PowerShell, you can still use it, right? Like, you're not locked down. I mean, let's say you get, I don't know, you get like an appliance that has this native command, you still know how to use it, even if you don't have PowerShell, you can still troubleshoot.
So you feel like Crescendo is like a short-term win that does a disservice in the long run?
Yes, and it also, I mean, I think it would be great if Microsoft, or there was like a community effort to maintain Crescendo modules. Like, some people I saw created stuff for like Robocopy or stuff like that. Then if Microsoft is not maintaining like these modules, or having like a huge community that manage these modules, then everyone does its own thing on their own terms, and it's not, doesn't really like, and it seems like a double effort.
Well, I don't think Microsoft plans to support any of those. I mean, I can't speak for them, but like a bunch of the community ones for wrapping internal tools, I think they just sought to provide a framework for some tools that may make sense if people in the community want to develop and kind of create them, but I don't know.
Yeah, so I think instead of that, you could just, work on getting the native support, like things to work even better than they are, and like improve on the cross-platform stuff that you already can do. I think it's a better effort than try to build like a tool that by itself like is not good enough, and you already have access to all these native commands. I personally think it's doesn't have a lot of use. I think well, I explained myself, but yeah, like
so here's an argument. Maybe for some people, they are just going down the happy path with a given piece of software. They don't really get too deep. They're not going to encounter many issues because they're kind of just running a couple of standard parameters, whatever. And they like piping the output to a different command to query things further, because maybe for some reason, like, there's multiple where you can pipe things together, whatever, because it works well with structured data. I could see that being a good use case for some people. But also, I think if the technology got to a good point and there was a healthy community around it, it could be interesting for other developers to view it as the way that I kind of tend to agree with you.
Proof of concept, I guess. Like, but
I don't see developers, if they were to create like a wrapper for their application, I don't see many really giving it the long-term attention. That would be my concern. It's like
exactly
there needs to be
right.
that
So,
follow
like,
through for good UX, or else you can't trust your tools. It's kind of
and if you look at the ecosystem, like the open, like things are moving so fast, right? Like there's tools popping up like left and right. Like I don't know how manageable it is to take all these like commands and wrap them. I think it's better, like, right, like, so it's better. So for example, like you can do, I don't know, like PS in like the native Linux command to show you the processes, and then PowerShell has get process, right? So like it makes more sense to do stuff like that, to create commandlets than wrap command. Like having a commandlet that wraps PS like doesn't make much sense. Like, but just build the tool. Like this is what I feel like. There's a lot of like modules that talk to directly to like a REST API of some application, rather than taking the application and like the CLI of that application, wrapping it. The only use cases that I think are good, that where it's like useful, is the secret management, right? So like I personally use like Bitwarden as my password manager, and like I have a self-hosted instance here in my home lab. And so like to get the secret from Bitwarden, I use the Bitwarden CLI, and it doesn't maybe make sense to to build like something that talks directly to the API of every password manager ever. Then I think it's like a good middle ground to use something like that. But for the most part, I think you get a lot more like, and PowerShell works so well with native commands that I think I don't see the major advantage of that.
Even when it comes to secrets, I think most of your password vaults have a module for that already.
Yeah, but like the Bitwarden module wraps the Bitwarden CLI, if I'm not mistaken. Like last time I looked at the code, like auditing it and trying to see like what it does. By the way, that's one of the modules that didn't work. Like the secret management with Bitwarden wouldn't work as a snap. Like it gave me like some low level. Like I remember I was talking to somebody like in the PowerShell community, like Trevor maybe, like helping try to get it to work. By the way, one time I packaged PowerShell as a app image just to see if it worked, but it never, like I never published it, but it does.
It does.
Yeah, I haven't built a module with Crescendo, but I could see it being, like you said, there's some risk to it not delivering great things, but potentially over time, I could see it being helpful in certain situations, especially if the technology kind of gets better. It could, there's just no doubt about it, though. Companies and product teams putting out first-party PowerShell modules that are supported and properly maintained and stuff like that would be the best, right? I completely agree with that, but. And I don't think Microsoft is strong holding our hands here to force us to use it. But given the state of resources, it may make sense to invest in a technology like this. But when you look at things like Crescendo, like the Graph API and stuff like that, it does seem like I don't know, it's less PowerShelly a little bit. I mean, obviously Crescendo is PowerShell, but the Graph API thing I'm not as fun with. Like everything being just API wrapped.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I like, and I said like I think there it makes sense, right? Like you don't wrap a native command, you just call the API. You make it like a nicer way to call the API, so you don't need to learn like. But yeah, like I mean, I guess it's good to have. I just think like resources could be put like I think it's in stuff where things get like the integration can be better.
I think it's like you said earlier, choose the right tool. Maybe
like
it's
like
not
for
the right tool.
for example, like one module that I use on all my Linux systems is there's a module Microsoft.PowerShell.Unix completers, which is it's a mod. It's like what this module does. So if you use PowerShell, you lose the native bash like completers. So a lot of times if you run like a native command and you press and it has an option and you press tab, it won't complete it unless you have this module. So because this module is like it digs into like the bash completion, pulls the information there and gives you like a way to use it in PowerShell. And I feel like this thing is, I mean, I feel like it needs better support. Like this stuff is like it bridges the gap of if you're on Mac, you can use like have better integration with your native commands. If you're on Linux, you have better integration. Like this is, I think, a point where like this kind of like bringing this tight integration is something that I think is where things could be better, right? Like I think this module needs to be installed out of the box on every machine that's not Windows, right? Like so then you install PowerShell and you wonder like, oh, why I enter a native command, I press tab, it doesn't complete my commands, for example, right?
So it almost seems like we have both sides that are ready and willing to make the next step for a full integration, and just something needs to do the project. So you have the longtime Linux users or Linux users that are interested in PowerShell, want to take advantage, and we have PowerShell where they're building things where it works on Linux, but we just need someone to bridge it all almost.
Yeah, I mean, like or create like a more cohesive experience, like that. If you install, so like you take PowerShell, you install it on a Linux system, you figure out or Mac, or you try to figure out like what you want to be better out of the box for the users that use these other platforms, and make the experience better, right?
Yeah, but
I mean, but on the other hand, like the fish-like completion that PowerShell has is amazing. Like I use it on every system. I can't imagine going back to like pressing like Control R and searching my history. Is like it's. I mean,
just press that right arrow.
It's just like peanut butter and jelly. Like
so it almost feels like when installing PowerShell 7 on any system, I guess that's not Windows, having like a list of, hey, these modules are recommended to make it behave most like native PowerShell, or not native PowerShell.
No, it behaves like native PowerShell, but if you run like Linux native commands, you're not going to have the completion. So they could just package the Unix completers module that Microsoft created. I would also allow package it, and then when you install, right, like the same way you have, I don't know, PS readline and stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff where Microsoft did a really good job, right? Like if you add the PowerShell repository to your like distro of choice, right? Like you're on Ubuntu, you add that. Then when you update the system, you get PowerShell updates, right? So like it's very cohesive. You take advantage of the system you're running on. Like there's other places where you could do the same.
Interesting. Here's a question. Going to Windows, but staying on Linux, because I have a question about Windows Subsystem for Linux. Have you dabbled with it?
Yeah, I have a lot of experience with it.
I've played with it. It's really cool from what I've seen. I used it, again, like I mentioned earlier, some CTF stuff. I run Windows Subsystem for Linux. I think I had like Kali Linux. And then inside of that, you get PowerShell. And then you run PowerShell from Windows on Linux. And Gosh, it's fun.
Yeah, you could do PowerShell remoting over SSH, all kind of good
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think WSL is a very good tool that Microsoft had to create to. I mean, a lot of new and exciting technologies like containers and a lot of that stuff is happening in Linux. It happens in Linux first. I mean, and they needed their developers to give developer access to that, and it's I mean I think it's good. Like it also helps you bridge the gap, and then maybe later you can move to a native Linux system, like or you don't like it, and but it's nice. You can run. I mean, every time I run WSL, I install PowerShell inside my whatever distro that I install there. Like it's um,
That's
it worked.
incredible, though. Think about that. I cannot believe we're working in our careers right now and we are playing with cool tools like that. To me, that's so wild.
Yeah, I mean,
It's always fun to see what amazing new technology you just can take for granted as you go on.
yeah, and I mean, like you can do so much. Like I mean, you could build containers with PowerShell inside of them to help. Like, I mean, like a lot of my containers. I just put PowerShell in there because it comes with a lot of, I mean, a lot of tools to help you diagnose when something doesn't work. Right, like you don't have to install, and it comes like in one package, and you get all this stuff. Obviously, you increase your attack surface by doing that, but I mean, for troubleshooting and debugging, and you get like you have a lot of access to a lot of cool stuff when you in a way it goes against the Linux philosophy, right? Like have it one tool and have that tool do one job and do it very well. But I think like the other shells, right? Like what I like about PowerShell, and I think it slowed down over the years, is like when it came out, they were like, how do we make all these things that make sense? Because to a person that figures out how PowerShell works, they that you give them another command, they'll it's easy to figure out what it does because you already know, like you're building on all this knowledge that you acquired and how it works, versus like what we were talking about earlier, like there's no cohesive in Linux commands. Like if one command has -n, it doesn't mean that another command that does something similar, the -n will be the same kind of thing, right? Like every command, whoever built it and it made sense to them, it doesn't have like a cohesive view of, like name is name and stuff like that. Like
No style guide.
no
I guess.
common parameters, right?
Yeah.
Like no.
Sorry to go back a little bit. I'm thinking of Crescendo. And you mentioned not enjoying text output and in Linux tools and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, isn't part of what Crescendo provides, at least on the low end, maybe not for all parameters, but at least for some, it can provide a simple way to handle the output and be able to output objects?
Yeah, so a lot of native Linux commands, like I don't know, like I take, because it's a good example. Like I take the kubectl for Kubernetes. A lot of them have like an output to like a JSON format, and then you just pipe it to convert from JSON, and you get the object, and you don't need like all the overhead. You can convert it, like you can output YAML and have like a module to convert from YAML. You could output a CSV and then do convert from CSV. Like you can do a lot of stuff. Like you don't have to be tied down to this, like what the Crescendo model. I mean, or whoever wrote the module that reps the command that you made. And a lot of times you have to make it, right? Because there's no let's say you take some esoteric command, I don't know, like tool that you installed, and let's say like we talked earlier about, I don't know, whois, right? So you have to build. So how long it will take you to wrap whois in Crescendo? Or you could just write whois and output like whatever format that PowerShell can convert into an object. And sometimes like these commands don't have that, right? And you just have to deal with the text. But then Crescendo wouldn't help you either.
But okay, so I think I'm in the boat of I am happy that it exists. I think that it can be a good option for some, but I definitely hear where you're coming from. Where there can definitely.
I'm not. I it exists. So like whatever I say, it has no meaning. I just think like that. As I said, like I think like it's better to work on what you have and have better, like the guy that I think there's like some intern I was reading, and I think it was the PowerShell blog. Like he's working on adding features and like more features to the archive module, like support more stuff, like native. I want PowerShell to. So every time I have to extract like a tar JZ file, I have to
expand archive.
What is the command again? Like it's dash XYZ whatever. Like I know it, but I'm just
I know exactly what you mean
for the joke. So I'm like, can't I do extract archive and give me the tar JZ and let it like do its thing? Like I wish. That's why and you have these files on Windows too. Like now, almost every tool, even if it's a Windows tool, comes in the tar.jz format. So like, I wish like this is like the stuff that I think really can help and improve. And obviously, you can have third-party modules to do all that, but you already have the blessed Microsoft way that comes in with the module. Like, why not improve on that, which they're doing? But I think more effort can go into that rather than wrapping commands and stuff like that. Like I would love to see Microsoft has Maui, like the new cross-platform UI for like .NET 7 and stuff like that. I would love to see somebody, I think back in the day they had the graphic tools that I don't remember. I think it was also like some intern at Microsoft that wrapped the Avalonia framework to create outgrid view on Linux machines.
Yeah,
I would love to see like more of that stuff using like new technologies like Maui that Microsoft created for cross-platform application and stuff like that, like in PowerShell. So you can build, like have a script that looks like a, native to the system you're on. And I think they said that they're going to work on it, but like I would love to see more cross-platform stuff like that. That I think a lot of people, like if you have, I think build like basic UI tools in PowerShell for users and stuff like that. I know I did, and that's why I played around with wrapping Pod Web with an Electron app in PowerShell so you can have like a native app running Electron and showing you like, so you can build everything like this whole thing in Pod Web and PowerShell and stuff like that. Like
it's pretty cool.
You have a tweet up on that. It looks like you used it. You built some dashboards using those together.
Yeah. So Pod Web, for those who don't know, it's based on Pod, which is a module that Matthew Kelly created, and it's amazing. He's an amazing guy. I hope you're going to have him on the show at some point.
I'm trying to reach out to him. I'm hoping he
he's busy. I think he tweeted that he had a baby or something recently.
Oh, congrats.
He's just going to put his family over talking to us.
Yeah, I know. So Pod Web, the PowerShell on Linux.com website is written in Pod Web. The code is on my GitHub, and I've been procrastinating, but I need to rewrite that thing to update a lot of stuff. So it's an amazing framework to build web applications using PowerShell, and then you can create buttons that similar to what PowerShell Universal used to do. Universal Dashboard used to do. And it's all open source, and so I built the PowerShell and Linux website using that, and I figured, oh, it would be cool if I can build like a native application, and I wrap it in Electron, and then so I created like Pod Anvil, and I was playing with it, but and I built some native applications using that, but I would love to see like more effort. I think a lot of people who are not I think every help desk in every company like has the same kind of stuff, and a lot of people like, oh, I want to reset a password for this user, so they build something like that, present it as a website that runs PowerShell behind the scenes, or like people provision VMs and they're like, oh, I behind the scene I call like the PowerCLI module. Like there's a lot of use cases there.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have some more UI focused stuff. And I think that your point earlier was that let's get some first party love for these Microsoft.PowerShell modules. Like there's some improvements that could be made that could go a long way.
Well, now you have me curious, because I did something where I was importing a time series database into Influx into Grafana.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that's something I could do similar with these modules, to where I'm not dealing with so many third party, but keeping it within PowerShell.
Yeah, I mean, like for example, it helps you integrate between things, right? So I'm a home automation enthusiast, so I have Home Assistant. It's like another open source product. Never mind, but
we know
I wanted to get information from my systems into Home Assistant. Home Assistant has REST API integration, so what I could do to get information that I don't know how, to build integration in Home Assistant. So I build something that using Pod that presents API, like the information in a REST API, and then I grab it from Home Assistant, and there we go. Like I can, and since I can write PowerShell, I can get information from almost anything into like my home automation and stuff like that, or vice versa. Like,
It sounds like we've started the basis of what I'm going to submit for my 2024 summit talk.
About what?
Just using these to do home automation to build a dashboard and everything. I like where we're headed. I'm stealing all your information.
How do you
So I wrote like like a few weeks ago when ChatGPT was like blowing up, I wrote like write in PowerShell a function to call like Home Assistant, like whatever. I don't remember what it was, and it gave me a function. I tested it and it was working.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So I can change the color of this light bulb from my PowerShell command. Like could make it PowerShell blue.
Look at you, dude. That's awesome. You've got the power over there.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention one other cool thing that I've done with Linux, which was developing remotely on a Raspberry Pi from my main machine using VS Code, like using the SSH thing to kind of interact with the files remotely. It just created a really nice way to always have on my home network a device to do things with, to glue things together, to tape things together like PowerShell does so well. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it works very well. There's only one problem, and I'm not sure there's like a solution. I think I was looking for solutions for that, and then people in our community, like the PowerShell and Linux community, was looking for a solution. The biggest problem is the way it works is that It also works the same thing I was talking about earlier, or about PSSudo. It like the SSH has like runs PowerShell in like a special mode, and it serializes and deserializes your object. So when you work with, if you try to read like user input, or you try to like use something like I don't know, like sudo in there, it's gonna get stuck, because it can't prompt. It's not like a real SSH-ish session, I would say. Like it's where you have a way to interact with the user. So I mean, for certain things, it's better to SSH and then run PowerShell, rather than because then you have you don't deal with this like serialize and deserialize, and then you can read user input. Like you can do a lot of stuff that like is like your experience is better. But
Yeah.
obviously, if you run stuff like automation, then you don't read user input and you don't have to do that. So like you for that part, it works great.
Jordan, I know you got some super important questions you want to ask, but I got to get one more. So you just mentioned scheduled tasks, or sorry, PowerShell, scheduled automation, whatever. How do you go about scheduling automation on Linux? How do you schedule your PowerShell?
So Linux has like, so this is a place, this is a good question, right? So I would I don't know if Microsoft should build something like that, or but it could be nice to have something like that built into PowerShell, where you can, so Linux, for most distributions, use cron jobs. So when I schedule stuff, I schedule them using cron, and I can call like the PowerShell executable -file or whatever, like, and call or do -command and type the whole command or whatever you want to do. But it could be nice because Windows has a lot of commandlets that are related to task management, but Linux doesn't have, because you have to. It could be nice to have something that does that for you, or rather than like deal with it yourself. But obviously, if you could still use the native platform stuff, like I said before, and you can learn how those tools work, and then you can do that. And it works pretty well. Like I mean, it just calls the executable with whatever parameters you give it.
It's nice. That's how I've done it in the past. It was in my mind. I know some other people might be thinking about that for their little home automation. So
yeah, like it could be nice. There's like it could be fun to try to maybe create like a community project that does something like that.
Yeah,
I know in our community there's at least few people that use Ansible to call PowerShell, and they like write their automations in PowerShell, but they use Ansible as the
orchestrator.
Because there's the whole that's another topic that's not and like 100%, I don't know what to call it, like baked, right? So you have DSC, and then Microsoft, like the desired state configuration, which is a cool concept for a lot of stuff, and I used a lot of DSC for a lot of different things. But then at some point they like decided like it didn't work on Linux, and then they like changing the way it works, and that takes me to another like hot take, right? I feel like, and there was somebody who was talking about it. I think it was like Steve Lee, about like creating like a .ps2. Did you guys see that?
I did. I saw some rumblings about creating a .ps2. Just I think it was to like support new features, kind of thing.
Yeah. So I don't know what's the solution for that, but I feel like PowerShell needs a way to have breaking changes. So I mean, Like, right, like you had Python 2, and then they went to Python 3, and they had like when PowerShell was new, they could do they could reinvent the wheel, like could do amazing things. And now, like it feels like that momentum has slowed down a little bit because they're afraid that things are going to break. And sometimes to move forward, you have to have better things. You need to break some stuff and to build on that, right? Like,
if Steve Lee mentioned it, it means it's definitely on the minds of the PowerShell team. So.
It does, but I think it's something to think as a community that uses PowerShell, right? Like sometimes you know to you have to. So then, for example, you have this whole thing with PowerShell. It felt like that point where you make like big breaking changes was when we went from, let's say, PowerShell 5 or like to the PowerShell core, PowerShell 7. There's a lot of stuff, like if you write stuff in PowerShell 7 and then you try to run it on PowerShell 5, like on the Windows PowerShell, then you'll have a lot of issues, right? Like the convert from JSON doesn't work the same way. Like a lot of things are different because commands are behaving differently, and it's in some cases it's good to have things, like you learn from the way something works and you want to make a breaking change and move forward. And I felt like from reading like the GitHub issue and stuff like that, I mean, when you bring more operating system and you take more things into account, I think it's a good thing to create some sort of, and I like the fact that Microsoft brought it to the table and they're talking about it, because I feel sometimes you have to have sometimes we have to break some things and change the way things work to have a better solution, right? Like to have something that can do more. And
it sounds like, so you're in favor of .ps2, right?
I'm not sure if I'm favor on. I mean, it doesn't have to be like a PS2. It can be, I don't know, like something in the header of the file where you give it, like like you do a validation or stuff
like you'd
like
require
that.
a module or something like that. Just
I hear PS2 and I just think of back in the days when mice weren't hot swappable.
I saw somebody was talking about like .pwsh or something like that. Like, but I don't think it's exact. The way you do it is not. I don't think. I mean, I think there's a lot of good ways. I just think that there needs to be a way where you could specify like a compatibility for version, or the same way you and move forward, like, and make the language, like, instead of, because when it was new, they could invent anything in a way that nobody thought of before, and that's the reason why we have something so powerful. But I feel like we can make it even more powerful, but now we have something that's holding us back because we don't want to break something. And sometimes you have to break something to make it better, right? Like because that's what happens with all these other tools, right? That they kind of stay in the past, and that's why they don't have a cohesive experience, and that's why all these things that PowerShell came to fix, and it's doing pretty well, I think.
Yeah, and for a little bit of context, Steve Lee looks like he opened up an issue about, is it time for .ps2 mode, which I guess would kind of, the general idea is that there would be new features or things like that that are hidden behind either a .ps2 file extension or, like you mentioned earlier, probably some other way. But definitely a lively discussion there. Check it out. It's on GitHub. It's open source, so I'll have it in the show notes if you'd like to contribute. And now, Jordan, I think you're equipped with some of the toughest questions in the Midwest.
Oh, yeah, in the Midwest.
I don't know why we're Midwest in it, but we're there.
Terrifying all that farm country. All right. Are you ready for the common parameters?
I am ready.
All right.
Are you shaking in your boots right now? Be honest.
Scary times.
Yeah.
All right. What is a time something went wrong at a job? How did you handle it, and what did you learn?
Okay, so I have a pretty good story here. I was working for a professional a managed IT services company, and we had like a small business client that we wanted to virtualize, and so my boss told me like, go there, there's this server, wipe it out, put like ESXi on it, and then we'll like do P2V and like, convert the machine. So I was asking him like, are you sure? And then he says, yeah. And then I got there and I called him again. I'm like, are you sure? And then he said, yeah. And then, okay, fine. Like I verified that this is the machine he wanted me to wipe. I put the installation disk, I wiped the machine, and then all of a sudden, like somebody at the company came over and said, "Oh, email doesn't work." I'm like, "Oh crap!" And I'm like, "Okay, I'm trying to figure out. Like, I can't." And then I realized that I wiped the machine with the mail server. It wasn't the mail server. It was, I think, Windows Small Business Server. It had everything on it, like the DC, the files, the everything. And
No.
and then I was like, okay. And then I called my boss. I'm like, you told me to wipe this thing. And then he's like, and I'm like, that now it doesn't work, this and that. Anyway, long story short, my computer was running Linux, and I had like the VMware workstation there, and I was very lucky that this thing was set up with Windows RAID. And I took the hard drive, I put in an external enclosure, and my Linux machine was running the small business server the whole weekend while I converted it to like a virtual machine to the server that I just wiped. And then like that's how I saved the day from the problem that I caused, because and
So-
that taught me to measure twice, don't delete, archive, turn off, wait, see if somebody screams. And I think this thing scarred me for life, because even in PowerShell, like I do what if, like every time something is like moving, deleting, like I'm super and even then, like I delete after I move or after I archive, or like so the what if feature of PowerShell is amazing.
that
And if
is
you
the
don't know
best.
what it is, go read about it. It's amazing. I mean, I think more commands should have it out of the box, right? Like
So
it's
I think if you do, when you're building out your module, if you use the common parameters, what if is there by default now? Maybe I'm way off on that.
I think you have to like implement the what it does, right? Like, so if you delete a file, then you have to
Yeah.
capture that, and then like, oh, don't delete. Like you need to handle it in your module for it to do that. But
Yeah. Supports should process, I think, is the
yeah,
attribute.
exactly. Yeah. So it's amazing, and like that thing that scarred me for life. And then when I discovered that PowerShell has, I can't, everything that's involved deleting, moving, like I do what if, I in back, like I measure 3 times, and then I use PowerShell to help me like visualize what I'm going to do before I do it, so then I don't, like
So the take
be the guy that said an out of office to everybody in the company by mistake because he piped it to,
Yeah.
So I would say it sounds like you did measure multiple times. You asked multiple times. So the takeaway of archive before delete, I think, is fantastic. But
Yeah.
were you clarified multiple times and got the go ahead? I don't think that's on you.
I mean, it's not on me, but I was the guy, I was the person in there, like at the, I was the technician on site. I was the sysadmin that came to do whatever. So, I mean, obviously, like if there was no way to recover, my boss, the owner of the company at the time, had to take the fall for it. But I mean, you can learn from mistakes of other people, right? Like you can, I mean, the same way as you can learn from your own mistakes and just improve on it, like and iterate. And obviously, it's the script you wrote when you first started in PowerShell, and you're like, what is this junk? I can't believe I did A and B and C, and you're like, now I look at script. I have like a folder of scripts from, I don't know, like years ago, and I'm like, I can't believe I did that. Like,
so if I look at my earlier ones, it starts with A, B, and C, and then just devolves into bad language.
1.ps1, 2.ps1. Yeah.
If it's not going well, you can tell how much I struggled based on how obscene my variable names are.
Yeah.
All right. Well, first one passed. Are you ready for the second common parameter? All right. With what you know now, what's one tip you'd give your younger self?
Good question.
With what I know, I think I mean, I don't know if it sounds condescending, but I think every mistake that I did is like what got me here, right? So like, I mean, it's kind of like the butterfly effect. I'm afraid of changing something. I mean, I guess it's not really a tip for me because I did that, but I have something that really like rings a bell, is that I started working for a big insurance company, like one of the biggest insurance companies in the US a few years back. And then after a year that I was there, like the guy from the help desk came to me and said like, oh, you're like, I should have been like hired for your position. And then I asked him like, okay, so like what have you improved? Like, what do you learn? Did you learn like, I think back in the times like, oh, did you learn PowerShell? Did you And he's like, oh, nobody's paying me to learn this. And I mean, yeah, nobody's paying you to learn. Like, a lot of times an employer is not going to pay you to learn. You learn so you can get your next job, so they will pay you like double what you make right now with the skills that you have. And like, this is exactly what I did over the years. And like, I would reinforce myself and like continue doing stuff. You'll fail, learn. I don't think there's I like the thing where like with the light bulb, where they say, Edison tried to make, like, he failed 100 times trying to make a light bulb, and then he said something like, oh, I learned 100 ways how to not make a light bulb. And I did so many, like, I mean, there's so many things, like fail forward, like everything you don't like. I mean, it's called life experience because you experience stuff and you learn how not to do stuff. You learned not to wipe a server that your boss tells you to wipe. You learned like a lot of things by messing up. I mean, and I think so many people can learn from that. Like, don't be stuck with what you know now. Like, I came to my boss when virtualization was happening, and I told him like, listen, this thing is going to be big. And he's like, nah, nobody's going to use that. And then I went like to another place in a different time, and I was like, listen, Linux is going to be the future. Everything is going to use that. It's like, Microsoft's too big, never going to happen. And then like, I was like, look, PowerShell is this amazing thing. I see like so much, and I think it's going to change like the way people operate. It definitely changed my career. I mean, I was like a help desk and I was system engineer, and then like PowerShell really allowed me to do stuff that I never thought I could do, like jump between this gap of like somebody that does an automation and somebody that's like a system, and now I'm a DevOps engineer. And it's like fail forward, learn from what you do. Like don't be afraid to mess up. Everybody messes up. Learn from your thing. Try it in the lab. Like do it in containers, in VMs. Like set up. Like I did so many like projects that my bosses at the time were like, oh no, I would experiment stuff in my lab, and then I would come to them and they're like, oh, we don't want to do this. And then I would lie and I would say like, listen, I did it at a previous job. It works perfect. Like, and it did. Like I mean, you learn, like you do stuff, you try it and scale, you know, like don't be afraid to, I mean, if you're the, I mean,
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Fail forward, be in there. It can lead to some great things. You're kind of evidence of it, right? You've gone through that journey of, learn some skills, make some mistakes, learn from it, keep going, and then life kind of rewards you. You get some good progress in your career, gain some confidence. It's awesome.
And you know, like don't be afraid to try new things, because maybe now PowerShell is the right thing and tomorrow it will be something else. Like you in our, I mean, in our careers, especially in IT, like people 20 years ago would never imagine what we do now, and we probably can't imagine what will happen in 20 years from now. Like you need to play with with all this new stuff, and don't be like, oh, this will never happen, because you just stay behind and you don't evolve.
All right, you ready for your final common parameter?
Sure.
What's your 3 favorite modules?
Okay, so I've already talked about one, and I'm going to do like self-shielding here. The PSSudo is really great, especially if you use Linux. And I've been working on like improving it and changing a little, like the way it works a little bit. But overall, it's pretty simple. And then I already mentioned the Microsoft PowerShell Unix completers. I think if you run Linux, or it's a must. Another thing I like is the console GUI tools for when you work on you know, like it's very nice to be able to you have like a terminal GUI, I guess, to do all kinds of things, and you can connect like native commands with that and do all kind, like it's very powerful and it's very good.
Is that the one with like out console grid view? Is that the command that it has?
Yeah.
Nice.
It's very, like, it's a lot of times, like I get information and you can filter and you can, do the same thing what you do with outgrid view, where you pass through the output to another command. If you could be like one output, or like select multiple items, it's very good. What
Nice.
else? And then there's like the standard stuff like DBA tools, Pod Web, the secret management. I mean, this is what I want Microsoft to do, right? Build these kind of stuff. Like this is something that everybody that uses PowerShell needs to do, deal with secrets, and I like it. I think it works very well. Like they also build like the local secret store that also works very well on Linux and stuff like that. What else?
No, I think you nailed it.
I think we got our 3. But Avri, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Andrew is a bit proficient when it comes to shilling. But what you might not know is he actually recorded all of his shills back in 1953. And 70 years later, they're all still relevant and they plug in perfectly every week. Mm-hmm. So right now I get a chance to tune in to what Andrew said, 70 years ago.
Wow, Jordan, thanks, man. I really appreciate that introduction. Been around for a while. You call me a wise guy. With all this wisdom, I'm looking back at this conversation, and one thing is coming to mind. Jordan, we need to get more people into PowerShell. We need more. We need to increase what we're doing. We need to take this to the next level this year. We need more people contributing to open source projects, getting their names out there, commenting on issues, all of that kind of happy stuff. Now, as far as we're concerned, thank you for listening to this awesome podcast. If you're on YouTube, give us a like, comment, subscribe. Share it with your neighbor, your cousin, anyone really. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review, and you can write a review too. We really appreciate it. And you can follow us at PowerShell Podcast, or you can email us at PowerShell@pdq.com, and you can tell us your thoughts and deepest, darkest secrets. Thank you so much to our amazing guest today, Avri. Thank you for joining us. If people want to keep up with you and tap in, where can we follow you?
So you can go to the PowerShellandLinux.com website. You can find the PowerShell and Linux Telegram group, or you could go to the the PowerShell community Discord server, and under the Linux channel, it all bridged together, or Matrix, or the Posh4Linux on Twitter. And yeah, they can find my alter ego, or the PowerShell Linux alter ego via Twitter, and I'll send you guys all the links so you can put it in the podcast. And yeah, don't be afraid to use Linux. Don't be afraid to use PowerShell. Don't be afraid to mix them together. They work great. And thank you guys for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast with your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plough.
2 kinds of flavor, 2 kinds of crunch.
The PowerShell Podcast is a production of PDQ.com, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.